Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse. Hey guys! So today it is my pleasure to have on the podcast my friend Romina Boccia from the Cato Institute about her new book, Reimagining Social Security, Global Lesson for Retirement Policy Changes. The book was published on August 12th of this year, 2025. And it's an important book because the trust fund, basically the program is going to be insolvent in 8 years. And that is significant because if there are no reforms, it will trigger some across-the-board benefit cuts. The unfunded obligation, basically the promises that we've made to people that we can't pay, has climbed to roughly $28 trillion. That's a big, big, big number. But rather than repeat the same Beltway talking points, even though we're going to do some of that to set the stage, this book looks at other countries, Canada, Germany, New Zealand, Sweden, and so on. And basically it asks what has worked in terms of Social Security reforms abroad. What should we learn from their positive experience, but also from their mistakes? What are ways to protect vulnerable seniors, reduce works disincentive, and restore fiscal sustainability? Romina is the director of Budget and Entitlement Policy at the Cato Institute, where she focuses on federal spending, the budget process, and reforms of programs like Social Security and Medicare. She's also the head of a really great dispatch called the Dead Dispatch. So welcome, Romina.
Thank you, Vera. It's good to be with you.
It's great to be with you. So your book is great. Reimagining Social Security, Global Lessons for Retirement Policy Changes. And you wrote it with someone, I believe.
Yes, my co-author is Ivane Nachkebia, and he's a research consultant for Cato. He lives in Europe, actually. So we both bring an international perspective to the topic.
Yes, that's great. So you published this book on August 12th. That was 2 days before the 90th anniversary of Social Security. Was that intentional?
Yes, actually, it was intentional. Last year in May, we hosted a conference with international experts on pension programs. And then we wrote the book after that, and I wanted to specifically publish it around the 90th anniversary of Social Security. And that's part of the idea behind reimagining Social Security, is that it's such an old government program that it's time to modernize it and not just make tweaks around the edges. I'm really frustrated with the debate in Washington around, basically trying to preserve the way this program works when it was established in 1935 at a time when things were very different. We didn't have 401ks and IRAs and auto enrollment for retirement accounts. It was just a very different era. Target date retirement index funds. Like, there's so many ways now that average people can build financial security without government dictating how much they have to save and what form and how much income they're going to have in retirement. So the idea behind the book is to really challenge the premise that we need to save Social Security or preserve it the way it's currently run, and say, no, let's rethink it. Let's reimagine what this program could be and how it might serve us better today.
I would go even further than you do. It's like in 1935, there are two essential things that were different. The first thing is we didn't have the financial markets that we have, the capital market, the modern capital market that everyone has been able to tap into and has actually created just this enormous wealth, especially in the US, right? That's the first thing. But the other thing that is strikingly different is that in 1935, precisely because we didn't have the capital market, it seems to me that if you weren't already wealthy, basically if you stop working, you're poor. You don't have savings. And it was and I think, and I assume this is in the spirit in which this program was created, is precisely to protect those who couldn't keep working because they were old and yet were poor, right? Was that why the program was created?
Yes, I mean, it came out of the Great Depression at a time when a lot of people were suffering economically. And this also came at a time of urbanization. Many people were moving away from local communities into cities and moving out of multi generational households because before retirement savings, the way that older people survived when they couldn't work anymore is that their family members
Yeah.
took care of them. And so some of those things changed that provided the rationale for Social Security, but that as a poverty protection program, it goes far beyond that. The purpose that far beyond the purpose that Roosevelt even imagined from his own writings and the speeches he gave on the program. It was supposed to be a modest anti-poverty benefit, and it looks very different today. But you're right.
So go ahead.
Yeah, financial markets, the way we enjoy them today, did not exist,
Yeah.
but now
So
they do. So,
yeah, now they do. Exactly. So can you actually kind of go a little bit into how do we get from this idea of behind the creation of Social Security, which was an anti-poverty measure, to where we are now? And then maybe just set the stage for how do people think about Social Security
yeah.
today?
So, yeah. So, Social Security it wasn't really that anti-poverty program that people imagined even going back then. One thing that's kind of interesting is when Social Security was established, the eligibility age was set at 65. By the way, it's now 67 when life expectancy has gone up by 17 years if you look at life expectancy from birth, and by 7 years if you consider just life expectancy at age 65. No matter what, our eligibility age has not kept pace with that. But, life expectancy then was 63, the eligibility age was 65. So it was really set up for those people who outlived the others in their cohort. Um, but even from the very beginning, it ended up being an income transfer program. If you think of the very first American to collect a Social Security check, I find the story of Ida Mae Fuller, who was that woman, very interesting because when she collected her first Social Security check in 1940, she had only paid in about 23 US dollars. And her first Social Security check was almost as large as her entire lifetime contribution. Just kind of crazy. And then she ended up living a very long life. And by the end of her life, she had collected 1,000 times what she had paid into Social Security and taxes at over $23,000, which in today's dollars is about $500,000 in value. And so the program was set up from the very beginning to transfer money from workers to the beneficiaries, the older retirees. There was no saving or investing that took place in the middle there. And this is where there's a lot of myths about Social Security because many beneficiaries today believe that it's a forced savings program. And they've heard of the trust fund and they think that it's actually a trust fund when in fact it's just an intergovernmental ledger or an accounting gimmick, if you will, because it's money in, money out. What workers pay today, pay out beneficiaries today, and no saving happening anywhere in the system. That's something that a lot of people don't understand. In fact, we just did a survey. The Cato Institute did a survey, and about a quarter of Americans, 1 in 4 Americans, believe that they have a personal Social Security account. So that tells you just how little understanding there is for how the program really works.
So this bank account with your name on it, does this date to the late 90s with Al Gore? Wasn't that kind of a campaign slogan? Like there's a or the lock. I know actually maybe he was the Lockbox
The
guy.
lockbox was going on at that
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
Yeah.
But it's this idea that somehow all the money you've been contributing through taxes has been put in a lockbox with your name on it. And that's really
Yes.
not at all how it works. And it's kind of interesting. Each time I write about Social Security, and like first, by the way, this is the time where I get the most angry emails is when I write about Social Security. And even when I try to kind of say, I'm gonna actually just like not even make it about reform, just like I mean, like the mere illusion that somehow people like explaining the pay as you go system, like gets people like emailing me emails telling me how evil I am, because they absolutely, there is money in there for them that they have a right to, because it's like, it's so bizarre. So can you actually explain really how it works?
Yeah. So the way it works is that it works like every other government program. The government collects taxes and then it either does something with them, or in this case, it redistributes the money. It takes the money from one group of people and gives it to another. So workers pay payroll taxes, 12.6% in total, split half between the employer and the employee. Although economists would argue that the employees pay the entire share. It doesn't really matter where you collect it from because it's part of your total
Mhm.
compensation. So if your employer didn't have to send that money to the government, they could pay you more. Um, so yeah, that's the tax portion of it. And those payroll taxes now fund about 85 cents of every dollar that Social Security spends. So the program is already running cash flow deficits. The
Since
dedicated
2010, right?
taxes, yeah, they're no longer sufficient. 85 cents on the dollar. And then we were collecting also some taxes on benefits. But those now have mostly gone away because the OBBA, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, eliminated most taxes on Social Security benefits by expanding the senior deduction significantly. So we're probably going to collect, 85 cents, maybe 86 cents on the dollar. And then the rest, in order to be able to continue to pay full benefits, is actually coming from additional borrowing. Because when Social Security was running surpluses, and this did happen from about 1983, the last time that Congress reformed Social Security over 40 years ago, to through 2009, the government actually collected more in payroll tax revenue than was necessary to pay out benefits. How much more? About $3 trillion. The problem is that the government has no mechanism for saving that money. So what happened instead is when we had those Social Security surpluses, the government turned around and spent them immediately on other things, including probably expansions of Medicare, like Medicare Part D was brought about during this time of Social Security surpluses.
2005.
Um, yep. And nothing was saved. The trust fund just records the fact that Social Security collected surpluses, but the fact that Treasury already spent them means that that money is no longer available. So yes, Social Security can go to Treasury now and say, "Hey, you owe us," but where does Treasury get the money from? They don't produce any
Yeah.
money. They get the money from us, right? They either tax us, they borrow the money from credit markets, and worst case scenario, they ask the Federal Reserve
Yeah.
to buy the debt and issue the money.
Which
Those are
is
your
one
options.
of the great frustrations that I've had for many years, because I would always hear the Democrats say stuff like Social Security doesn't contribute to the deficit, and I mean, and it was true before 2010,
Right.
and it hasn't been true since 2010, precisely because in order to pay full benefits, as you've explained, Social Security takes one of these IOUs and just goes to Treasury and say, pay us back. And Treasury doesn't have the money and has to go and borrow the money. Hence, it contributes to the deficit. So that's interesting. When I was reading your book, there's just, so somehow I knew it, but I never actually kind of thought about it this way. The fact that this program has not been reformed since 83. So can you tell us actually what happened in 83, why it happened?
So in around 1982, 1983, the Social Security Trust Fund was running out of money the way that it is now. When I say running out of money, that's not really accurate. It is intergovernmental accounting ledger. So the money that was credited to the Social Security program from prior payroll tax surpluses was being depleted, and that means that Social Security could no longer ask Treasury to give it the money. It stopped its borrowing authority. It's just a legal mechanism where
Yeah.
Congress says we're not going to spend beyond that amount. And so that was happening then. And then we had the Greenspan Commission. Congress stood up a bipartisan commission to try and find a solution to this problem. The Greenspan Commission actually failed. They did not come up with a plan that would make Social Security long-term solvent. So then Congress was still confronted with automatic benefit cuts, which is the legal mechanism that the US government has established. If a Social Security's trust fund goes to zero, then the program is only allowed to pay out what it can collect from workers in payroll taxes. And so beneficiaries would basically have to take a haircut. And Congress wanted to avoid that, as you can imagine, at all costs. So when the Greenspan Commission gave them a partial proposal, Congress actually stepped up at the 11th hour, if you will, to avoid those automatic benefit cuts. And they ultimately passed a comprehensive reform package that got us to this point today. So it brought about solvency from 1983 to 2010. And since then, we've started running cash flow deficits again. I don't love to credit the program with the prior payroll tax surpluses, in part because they really enable the government to spend more or keep other taxes lower than they otherwise would, when Treasury can spend surplus monies that are supposed to go to a particular program benefit, but they've spent them on other things. It's kind of like we're getting charged twice. We get charged
I
for the
agree.
excess
I
payroll
agree.
taxes, right? And then we have to pay them
I
back later.
I agree so much with this. What I like when I learned about this, right? I thought it was one of the most immoral thing I'd heard, where you had people who were like, you pay taxes your whole life through Social Security, and then it's spent, and then you have to borrow all over again with all the consequences that. And I just thought so. Let me kind of ask you this. So what did the 1983 reforms? So they there was an age, they pushed the retirement age.
Yeah, they did.
Did they
They
come?
phased in a 2-year increase from
Yeah.
65 to 67, but it took 40 years to phase it in fully. Like we're just now phasing it in fully.
Oh
That
wow.
was such a slow increase.
Yeah. And so what about, so do you know why they made the decision rather than have the excess payroll tax collected, invested in actual, in the market, in the
Yeah.
market? Why is it that the mechanism they came up with was to actually give the money, to Treasury to spend on stuff, and then just kind of give this IOU? Was the logic behind this that, oh, the market's too unreliable, or was it like treasuries, like the full faith of the US, blah blah blah, the US dollar, blah, it's so great, and so there'll never be any problem?
I think you can find a lot of reasons for why you might structure something this way, but I think the public choice reason is probably the right reason, which is that it was too tempting for Congress to collect the money and have it available to spend in other areas.
Hmm. Yeah, this is why, actually, by the way, during the pandemic, there were a bunch of people who actually suggested to have a pandemic fund created. So you would collect money that you would spend during the pandemic, but the mechanism was the same as Social Security. And I was like, are you guys insane? It's like it seems completely crazy. So now, so we are past the point where we are running, the program is running permanent cash flow deficits since 2010. But there's another really big deadline coming, and that's 2033. What happens then?
Yeah, so according to the trustees report in 2033, Social Security will run out of its borrowing authority from Treasury and will have to institute automatic benefit cuts. It will only be allowed to spend out in benefits what it collects in payroll taxes until Congress changes the law. However, I actually think this is now going to happen in 2032 because
Of the
Congress made
big deal.
two major changes this
Yeah,
in
yeah.
2025. In January, they repealed the so-called windfall elimination provision and the government pension offset provision. Basically, increasing benefits for public sector workers
Oh,
who
that's right.
only paid into Social Security for a limited period of time, not their entire careers. They're now getting huge windfalls. That's going to add about $200 billion to deficits over the next 10 years and will pull forward the trust fund depletion date by 6 months. And then in July, with the reconciliation bill, the Republicans practically eliminated taxes on Social Security benefits with the enhanced
Hmm.
senior standard deduction, where like 90% of beneficiaries will no longer face any taxes on their Social Security benefits. So that reduces Social Security funding by a significant amount too. So at this point, I think it's looking like 2032 is that deadline. But like I said, it's a legislative deadline. Is Congress said we recorded the amount of payroll taxes we collected from Social Security. Treasury borrowed them from Social Security, but keep in mind they're part of the same
Yeah,
government.
yeah,
And then actually we are also owing interest on that money that Treasury borrowed. So that's
yeah,
that's
yeah.
that's how they come up with the trust fund depletion date.
So where do you fall on the debate of whether the trust fund assets are assets or not assets? Are they real? Are they,
Yeah.
I think they're real, but they're real even though I understand what they are, right? I just think that saying that it's all a myth and it's like it's so I was just wondering where you
Yeah.
fall on this
So
debate.
I I've done a lot of thinking about this. And my thinking has changed on this because we have not yet gone out to the market and said, "Hey, will you lend us money?" What happens now is the Social Security has an IOU, and it goes to Treasury and says, "Hey, we need that money back now." And then Treasury goes and to the market and says, "Will you please lend us some money?" And so when that transaction takes place, that is when we actually realize the bond.
Yeah, yeah.
But, if Treasury goes to the market and says, "Hey, I need $200 billion to pay the Social Security cash flow deficit this year," and bondholders go, "You know, we don't think you are budgeting responsibly and we're really worried about inflation and now we're going to charge you a much higher interest rate." Like we are beholden to those bondholders to get those resources, or we're going to have to ask the Fed to monetize the
Hmm.
debt, and then we're going to pay for it through inflation. But I don't think they're assets in the sense that US Treasury bonds that are in the market, marketable securities, are assets. I think it's an IOU
Yeah.
that is an intergovernmental debt, technically speaking, but that doesn't have any economic value.
No, so I agree with you on all of this. I just think that it actually is more. It's an obligation that is actually real. In order
Yes.
to in order for that IOUs to disappear, Congress would have to act, right? And it's when there are no more IOUs that the benefits are getting cut because so they are the reflection of something that is real, and
So
we
I would
can.
say, in that sense, we have an obligation
Mhm.
to the people who've been told that 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 the money they paid they would get back with interest. That you could maybe call that a moral obligation because
Mhm.
even though people had no choice, it's not like they bought a security, right?
Yeah.
They got forcefully taxed and they were told a nice story to make them feel better about what was happening in this transaction.
But in order to make it go away, right, to make these IOUs go away, Congress would have to act. It's not as if, Congress, like the Treasury could just say, oops, like, or Social Security could just
That's
say,
right, but isn't
or,
the same
or,
true for food stamps or Medicaid obligations? Like anything Congress has authorized that's not voted on annually as
but
part of the discretionary budget?
this is a little bit different in the sense that when the chest drawer, whatever that holds all these IOUs is empty, that's it. Benefits are cut, right? And
Yes.
so it's different in that sense than just Congress authorizing a program. It's in that sense that it is slightly different. So I don't know. It's just kind of like I'm always a little. I like the way when you talk about it's basically it's like an accounting. It's real. It's real somewhere, right? And whether it's, but anyway, so I just wanted to ask you
Yeah.
this.
So basically, Congress has decided to put Social Security on a budget.
Yeah.
And that budget is defined by the amount of payroll taxes the government
Hmm.
collects, plus if there's excess payroll taxes and the Social Security Administration gives them to Treasury to spend on other things, the interest that Treasury, which really it's us,
Yeah.
taxpayers, owe to Social Security as a result. That's how they have set that up. They could do that with other government programs. They choose not to. People do sometimes ask, why is it that if I'm a recipient of a welfare program like Medicaid services or food stamps, why are those programs never running out of money? Why are they never getting depleted and we're facing automatic benefit cuts? Why is that only true for Social Security? That is, I think, a legitimate question to ask. And then the next question is, what kind of mechanism does this trust fund depletion date set up? And what kind of political outcomes can we expect from that? Because
Hmm.
I don't think anyone believes that Congress will let automatic benefit cuts take place. So it sets up a legislative action forcing mechanism. And this is very different from other countries that have, you might call it an automatic stabilizer in the system
Hmm.
where it limits the spending to, a certain amount of revenue. This is something we looked at in our book because the mechanism we have in the United States where when you come up to trust fund depletion and then there are massive automatic benefit cuts. In the case of 2032, we're looking at a 24%
Yeah.
benefit cut. And
Across the
that
board, right?
across the board, as far as we know,
Yeah.
some folks are arguing that maybe the Social Security Administration has some discretion for how to apply it. But as far as we know, it would be across the board. This has never happened before in US history. Congress has never allowed this mechanism to actually take place. So we have no precedent. We don't know actually how it would be carried out. And politically, sounds like that's never going to happen. So then the worry is, well, if we wait until 2032, there will be a massive cash flow deficit that we'll have to fill in that year. And so we'll need an immediate revenue infusion to avoid that. Or we have to figure out on whom to concentrate much larger benefit cuts so we can avoid, the average benefit cut of 24% for the poorest people.
Once I had lunch with my colleague Chuck Blauhaus, who was a Social Security trustee, and one of the things he told me, and I don't know if we have more clarity about this, is like when the cuts come, he wasn't sure legally whether the program would have to cut across the board and like basically say we're going to cut the benefits and the benefits are going to keep going out every month, or if Social Security would legally have to collect all the tax revenue to be able to pay the entirety of benefits. So basically, instead of getting a 24% cut every month on your benefits, what you're getting is like weeks where you're not getting the benefits until you get one full payment. And he was saying this, and I don't know if we have more clarity on this now, but either way, it's just totally responsible that we're like this. And we're at this point. It's totally responsible that, I mean, in your book, you talk about how, I thought that was super interesting, that the trustees started ringing the alarm about the program in 84.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right.
So it's not as if people, including members of the government, or at least trustees of those programs, Social Security and Medicare, haven't been ringing the alarm. And this is one of the things that I thought was really really interesting in your book, is like rather than kind of actually talk about like are we gonna increase spending taxes, or are we gonna cut benefit, or do a mix of both. Your book looks at 4 countries that have reformed their programs. And it's so interesting because it wasn't so long ago that we thought about how Sweden was a basket case, right? And yet Sweden is on the list of these countries that have reformed. So it's like Sweden, Canada, New Zealand, and Germany.
Germany.
Germany, right? And the thing that I thought was super interesting is like they were proactive. They Am I remembering this right? That all of them proactively reformed their program before they got in trouble.
Yes, For context, though, it was usually at a time when they already faced high interest rates and
Yeah.
they were
Well,
running up
yeah.
against a broader budget constraint.
Yeah.
And, pension and healthcare programs tend to be the biggest drivers of deficits and debt in
Hmm.
countries. That is something we apparently have, most of us have in common. And so, yes, but they have been proactive since. You see, in many countries, they don't just reform their programs every 40 years.
Yeah, exactly.
um,
Sweden, for instance, like
yeah,
Sweden had. So, for instance, can you tell us about Sweden? Because I thought Sweden was actually quite interesting, right? Because it started reforming in '94. Am I remembering this correctly?
yeah, most of these countries started reforming around the 90s, early 2000s when they were running into some fiscal challenges. What I like about Sweden is that it actually introduced a partial private account
Okay.
carving out of the existing payroll tax base so people could invest money through their government forced retirement accounts. And that private account has had such a significant return that it makes the other components of the Swedish system less necessary. So it's kind of interesting how when you let people save more in accounts that they own and where they can invest it in private markets, you get a much higher return than from a pay as you go program that
So,
then makes a pay as you go portion less
so,
significant.
so is it like our the Roth and the 401k? Which country actually has a Roth 401k type thing without any limit? Is it Sweden?
That I'm not familiar with that. They don't
Actually,
have a
I
limit on tax benefits.
there's one that had that you talked about. So I may misremember this. There's
So the one thing we highlight is Canada's
Canada.
tax-free savings
Yeah.
account. It does have contribution limits, but they are they accumulate over time when you don't use them. So let's say it's a $10,000 contribution limit
Mhm.
annually where it's Roth treatment.
Oh, so you can catch up.
You can catch up. So if you can only put in 5,000 one year, you could put in 15 the next. So
Oh
you
yeah,
can
that's
aggregate your limits over time, which is different from the US version, where if you can't max out in one year, tough luck. We don't
yeah,
let you
yeah.
add anymore until you get older and then you can catch up contributions. So that gives you a lot more flexibility. But what I think is actually much more important about the tax free savings accounts in Canada and something that we recommend for the United States is that there's no early withdrawal penalty. So
Yeah.
it's not like a 401k.
So it's more like a universal savings account.
It's a universal savings account, and that's super important because that allows younger and lower income workers to save in these accounts.
Can we
Because,
can we explain can we explain how universal savings account work? Because
yeah,
that's one
so
of your recommendation for the US, and I totally and fully agree with you. Um, this is
yes.
central.
So, we have a problem with when people save outside of a qualified account in that there's a double taxation problem where you pay taxes on your income and then if you save that income, you get taxed again on the gains of your savings and investments. And so there's a couple of accounts like 401ks, for example, where you can make a tax deferred contribution where you don't pay income tax when you put the money in your 401k account. And then when you aggregate the gains without paying taxes on those over the time period, you aggregate them. And then when you take money out of the account, that's when you pay the income tax on it. The Roth is like the reverse. You pay your income tax first, but then you don't pay any tax when you take the money out. Either way, all of these, what these accounts have in common is that you want a neutral treatment of savings. And so universal savings accounts apply that concept to other savings, not just for retirement or your health savings account or other carve out accounts that the government established, like the new Trump accounts, although they don't even benefit from this treatment to begin with.
Or
But
like a 529 for
yeah,
education.
yeah. Like a lot of these accounts are highly complex and are very specific for a specific purpose. And if you take the money out for anything else
You
or
have a big
before a certain
penalty.
date, you pay a penalty, and those penalties fall primarily on lower income workers who can afford them the least. It's like when someone takes money out of their 401k, it's often because they need it more urgently for something right now, whether it's a health emergency or they lost their job and they run out of unemployment, their car broke down, they need a new one to get to work, whatever it is for why people need to tap into their retirement accounts, they get penalized if they do so. With a universal savings account, people could save for any need, for emergency needs, for education, for retirement, for health needs. Basically, the government wouldn't dictate what the purpose is for this
Mhm.
particular savings account. It would just say, if you save up to this limit in this account, you will get the neutral tax treatment of savings. That's sort of the idea. And it's interesting to me that Canada has a larger accumulation of private retirement assets as a share of GDP than the United States. Like, I would expect the United States, being a wealthier country, having
Significantly
lower
wealthier.
taxes than
Yeah.
Canada, to have a higher accumulation of private
Mhm.
retirement assets. But Canada actually has a higher one. And I wonder how much of this is that in Canada, there's just more flexible savings vehicles that make it possible for people to save more without all these strings attached and these
Yeah.
complications.
Because the thing also is it's not just that you get penalized when you get the money out. Let's say it's in a retirement account and you get it out, when you're 40 because you have your car breaks down, as you said. But it's that precisely because of that penalty, a lot of people don't actually save. And
Right.
that's the real penalty. And that's the innovation behind the universal savings account. It's like you can take the money out whenever you want for whatever you want. And as a result, there's actually, when you remove the high penalty and the fear of getting your money stuck without
Yeah.
having to pay this high price, you find that people actually save more. So Canada has them, the UK has them. I never realized that the universal savings account in Canada was put in place in the context of pension reform.
Mm.
I actually learned this in your book.
Well,
For
yeah.
whatever, I mean, I knew about Social Security, about universal savings account in Canada, but I never actually realized that it was in this context. So we like that. That's really good. What are
Yes.
the other reforms around the world that you think we should emulate?
Oh, I
Um,
think the most important one is automatic stabilizers that aren't so blunt and sharp as the trust fund depletion date and the automatic benefit cuts that we have in the US.
so can you
Um,
explain?
so, one automatic stabilizer, for example, would adjust eligibility ages automatically with changes in life expectancy. Like,
Mhm.
if you set up a system with a fixed eligibility age, like now it's 67 in the United States, and people's life expectancy increases, which it has, and that's a
Mhm.
good thing. But if you don't adjust the eligibility age for your program, that means you're baking in that the program is going to cost more and more money over time because people will be on the program longer. And so if you're not adjusting how many more years they work and you're just giving them many more years of benefit payouts, then that is not fiscally sustainable over the long
Yeah.
term, unless you're having a huge influx of new workers that are going to be able to cover the cost of that. You have to adjust your programs
Mhm.
as these demographic parameters change. And so that's a big one. And many of the countries in our book, in fact, all of them except the US, have automatic stabilizers based on age. Another version of automatic stabilizers that Sweden and Germany have, for example, are to consider your demographic ratio. How is your number of workers
Mm.
to the number of beneficiaries taking out benefits? How is that adapting? And because you have options, right? It doesn't, in order to keep the system balanced, that doesn't always have to mean increasing taxes on workers. Sometimes that can mean slowing benefits for current beneficiaries to rebalance things. And so I like those kinds of stabilizers too. Germany has more of a reliance on higher taxes. In Sweden, there's more of a reliance on reducing the growth in benefits. My preference would be for the Swedish variety of this adjustment factor. But the idea is that it is so politically toxic to talk about retirement program reform. That's why Congress hasn't touched Social Security in more than 40 years, except to increase people's benefits this
Yeah.
year, but hasn't done anything to rebalance the system as it's been getting more and more out of balance. Our demographic ratio has shifted significantly. We went from 16 workers for every beneficiary in the 1950s down to 3 workers for every beneficiary today. Now, some of this was Congress expanding who was eligible for benefits.
Mhm.
So they've been very good about boosting benefits, not so good about curtailing them. These automatic stabilizers recognize the political difficulties and build adjustments into the programs that don't require legislative action. But you kind of establish from the outset, what are we trying to accomplish? What do we think is fiscally sustainable over the long term? And then how do we design the program to automatically adjust to demographic and economic realities changing in a more fair manner that distributes the costs and the benefits of the program across the workers and the beneficiaries. So that one I think is a key lesson that we should take away.
Another reform options that you have and that is inspired by these countries is like having, and I actually really like this, is having a flat benefit.
Yes, I think that is key. So what we have in the US right now is a loosely defined earnings related system
Mm-hmm.
where the benefit formula which is highly complex is also highly progressive,
Mm-hmm.
replaces a certain amount of your earnings up to a certain limit, and then a lower share of your earnings up to a different limit, all the way up to the payroll tax max. Because roughly $180,000 of earnings are subject to payroll taxes, and that's also where the benefit calculation ends in any given year. But what an earnings related system does is that when you have very, very low earners, they might end up with very, very low benefits. And if you have very high earners, you might end up with very, very high benefits for them. So the US system pays the highest benefits to the highest income earners, who, yes, they also paid more in taxes. But still, in terms of the overall size of those benefits, they don't relate to the taxes people paid in large part because of a quirk in the benefit formula, where when people first apply for benefits, we don't just look at their earnings and taxes paid and then adjust for inflation, perhaps, but the system actually indexes those initial benefits to wage growth in the economy. So when people first apply, their wages earned in 1980 get treated as if they had earned them in 2023.
Yep.
And so their replacement rate is based on that wage adjusted earnings record. And so the maximum benefit that an individual can get from the US system is $60,000 a year from Social Security. And for a couple, if both earners are high earning, it could be $120,000 a year for a couple to receive from Social Security. That same couple in the UK, which is transitioning away from an earnings-related benefit right now to a
Mm-hmm.
flat benefit, would collect about $37,000 after adjusting for purchasing power parity in
Both of
US
them.
dollars. Yeah, together. Instead of
Yeah. So it creates
120,
enormous incentive to save.
yes, because the idea behind a flat benefit is that you know what you're going to get from the government, so you can decide how much more you need to save in order to get to the living standards that you want to attain, and that the benefit you get from the government keeps you out of poverty.
Mm-hmm.
Or in some countries, it's a measure of your average wage, like say 40% of the average wage, accounting for the fact that many seniors own their own homes, so they don't need as much income in retirement as they did during their working years when they were still accumulating savings and the like. But it also means that you can structure the flat benefit around the income needs of the population you're trying to protect from poverty. So I think that a poverty related benefit, or maybe 125% of poverty, 130, people have suggested different numbers, can make a lot of sense because you can meet that goal of poverty protection in old age, but do so at lower cost. And you also reduce the disincentives to save, because Social Security, by
Mhm.
being so generous, especially for higher income earners, crowds out private savings, which reduces capital accumulation and reduces economic growth. Because
Mhm.
instead of people saving more in private accounts and investing that money in the market, making that capital available for business investment, the government takes so much in the form of payroll taxes, but then also gives people such a large benefit in retirement that there's less incentive to
Mhm.
to save more privately. So it's economically inefficient on both sides. It
Yeah.
would be better if we tax people less and paid them a smaller, more predictable benefit, and let workers keep more of their own money so that they could save it as they see fit. But some of this is just pure paternalism, the idea that workers are too short sighted. And if
Mhm.
the government doesn't dictate what kind of income replacement they should have in retirement, and then forces them either to save in a compulsory savings account, or with Social Security, it's even worse, just sets up a redistribution scheme that most people just won't save enough. And I question that. I do not believe that is true. But even if you're concerned about that, you can address that concern with a sufficiently high flat benefit. So your myopic worker that wouldn't otherwise save will get that from the government. And then beyond that, people can save to meet their own income needs. So I'm a big fan of a flat benefit for that predictability and just reducing the burden that the system poses. Because when you have such generous benefits as we have in the
Mhm.
US, you also need to raise so much in taxes. For example, if we just wanted to continue to keep paying the current benefits, not do any benefit reductions, and just raise payroll taxes to the point where we could pay for them, the payroll tax would have to go up to roughly 16.5%
That's
from
roughly
twelve and a
20
half
that
percent.
that's
Yeah.
that's 25% increase rate or something like this, isn't it?
Yeah.
3%?
Yeah.
Yeah. 3%. It's a 3-point increase, so that's 25% increase,
It's a four
roughly.
percentage point
And
increase.
so yeah, it's 24. It's
Yeah. So it's
yeah,
about a
yeah.
third.
Yeah, it's a third actually, yeah.
Yeah. It's about a
Um,
third.
mhm.
And that, for the median wage earner who makes about $67,000 a year, that is like another $2,500 tax payment. It brings their payroll taxes to about $10,000 a year.
And by the way, it's for, for all, we often talk about the problem with the income tax, which is extremely distortive. It's all sorts of bad things. But like most people don't realize that for most Americans, the most burdensome tax that they pay is in fact the payroll tax. It's a very heavy tax. It's a very more regressive tax, and it's a big deal for more people. So, and the reason why actually I am so against addressing the problem of the Social Security insolvency on the tax side is that, as you've explained, I mean, effectively the system is extremely unfair and regressive as it is. It means basically because seniors are overrepresented in the top income quintile, the system is, it wasn't designed to be this way, but it is a massive transfer of wealth from the relatively young and poor to the relatively old and rich. And effectively, if you solve the problem on the tax side, you're making the problem worse. So this is why, I mean, I'll fight till my last breath. So we don't address this problem on the tax side, because it just would make, this injustice even worse.
Yes, I like to call it the Robin Hood principle in reverse.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
you take from the poor and you give to the relatively wealthier and affluent. Um, and it is unfair, but that's why also many progressives will call for not broad-based payroll tax increase, but they'll say, let's eliminate the payroll tax threshold, or the so-called tax max. We're right now up to $180,000 roughly in annual income, subject to the payroll tax earnings, I should say. People who earn more than $180,000 a year stop paying the Social Security payroll tax at those higher levels of earnings.
But
And
that wouldn't be
so
enough. That wouldn't be enough, right? To fill the gap.
So first, it wouldn't be enough to solve all of the gap. However, this is a very dangerous proposal because it would make the trust fund look almost 90% solvent on paper.
Yeah.
However, the way you would bring about this new revenue is you would have 5 years of payroll tax surpluses. And then in year 6, you would actually go back to cash flow deficits where your payroll taxes collected no longer are sufficient to pay out your promised benefits. But during those 5 years of payroll tax surpluses, unless you actually establish a lockbox or
Exactly.
set up private
They're
accounts,
basically blowing
the
all that
government's going to
money.
use that money and spend it on something else. They're going to probably expand paid family leave or do,
Yeah.
one of their
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
wish lists of things that they want to do. And so I hate that proposal in part because I believe the government will use that revenue in other areas and leave us with the higher debt to then repay the Social Security obligations in turn, plus a bigger government as a result of whatever they decide to fund with those surpluses.
Yeah.
Because that's what happened when we had surpluses in the 80s into the early 2000s, is
Hmm.
that it reduced the size of the budget deficit because Treasury, instead of having to borrow the money in the market, borrowed it from Social Security, which then created more borrowing space
Yep.
for Congress
Yep.
to spend more money in other areas. And it made things politically possible, like the creation of Medicare Part D, for example,
Yep.
that may not have been possible if it hadn't been for those Social Security
Yeah.
payroll tax surpluses.
And of course, as you talked about this at the beginning, which is that the moment they're going to go to the market eventually to say we need let's say $200 billion to fill that gap for this particular year, and investors are kind of like, yeah, you know what? I just worry that you're going to be repaying me with inflated money down the road. Then inflation rises. Seniors won't care as much because their benefits are indexed to inflation.
Right.
So it's this like it's inflation. It's unfairness going multiple direction at the same time, and it's yeah. I want to ask you a final question. What are the lessons you think of the? What are the mistakes that we need to learn from other countries?
Uh, so I think other countries can learn more from our mistakes.
Yeah.
I learned a lot more what we should be doing instead
Yeah.
uh, from other countries. And one big thing is, how can we overcome the political obstacles to reform, like the
Yeah.
fact that these other countries have been making changes all along, and we've been doing nothing meaningful to fix Social Security's financing gap in more than 40 years. I think is the problem. And in those other examples, they either relied on a commission to
Hmm.
create the safe space to have the bipartisan
Hmm.
negotiations. Or in the case of New Zealand, that's very interesting. And their political system agreed to an accord that they weren't going to
Hmm.
attack each other on pension reforms or campaign against each
Hmm.
other, which it's hard to imagine in today's political environment in the United States. In terms of mistakes, I think Germany is probably the most cautionary tale in the book because they have a horrible, devastating old age dependency ratio.
Yeah.
The number of seniors to the number of younger workers is so upside down that it's really putting a lot of stress on younger workers to finance obligations for seniors. And they're already financing 30% of their pension benefits, government retirement benefits, with general revenues. And that's maybe a cautionary tale that Congress may be tempted in 2032 to open up Social Security to just keep borrowing the money to keep paying full benefits the way that we're borrowing money right now to cover the payroll tax gap. Like, there's no reason for them not to open that can of worms. But that can very quickly grow out of control. Today, we're already financing about 15 cents on the dollar for Social Security benefits with borrowing. In Germany, that's 30% now. And
It's
there's
crazy.
pressure for it to go even higher. And if we go down that path, our gap
Mhm.
will also widen over time. And that really takes pressure off the system to adjust benefits if you're just trying to find a new source of revenue. Other organizations around town here in DC that have proposed new sources of revenue include calling for a value added tax to finance the Social Security fiscal gap. So I think that's probably the most cautionary tale that I would emphasize is we need to be very careful about not opening up the program to new revenue sources that ultimately just delay the necessary and I think very smart benefit reforms that we should be making, like transitioning away from from an earnings related system to a flat benefit, which could also be based on years worked, for example. So it's still an earned benefit. You just calculate it based on how many years people worked and not make it based on their income, for example, and to adopt automatic adjustment factors as economic and demographic factors change. The system should adapt automatically with them because it's so dependent on, say, the ratio of workers to retirees and the life expectancy, to name two of the biggest factors driving program costs. And to slow the growth in future benefits, like you see in many systems, like the Swedish and the Canadian system, where you're not cutting anyone's benefits, which would be politically difficult, but you change the benefit formula in a way that most people don't even realize because it's so highly complex that most people have no idea what to expect from the system, where you can actually slow the growth in benefits without doing much harm and saving a lot of money over time. In fact, just one change in the US system, moving from wage indexed initial benefits to calculating
Price.
them based on inflation,
Yeah.
would close the vast majority of the funding gap. And you would do it by slowing the growth in benefits, which is the right thing to do, especially if you look at how income has grown for the elderly retired population over the past few decades, in large part because of Social
Mhm.
Security being indexed to inflation and initial benefits being indexed to economy wide wage gains, not worker specific or
Yeah.
industry specific, but economy wide, meaning that as higher income earners have outpaced the earnings of other income groups, that has pulled up Social Security benefits significantly compared to what workers have benefited from. And so the income inequality we're perceiving increasingly in this country is actually among older retired people whose incomes grow much faster, and working age
Yeah.
Americans. And
Yeah.
so those are some of the things to keep in mind to rebalance our social contract by reimagining this program in a way that it's more generationally equitable and economically and fiscally sustainable.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. So the book again is really, I really recommend it. It's first it has this striking it starts with a story of this woman who gets out of, she's a nurse, I think,
Yes.
right? She's a nurse, and she's all of a sudden she's realizing, she's kind of taking stock in the fact that, oh, actually benefits may not actually be there for us. And so it's very well done. So the book is called Reimagining Social Security: Global Lessons for Retirement Policy Changes. And Romina, who is always worth reading at the Dead Dispatch, is the author, with Ivan Nachekebia.
Yeah,
Yes?
Ivana Nachkevia.
Yeah. Thank you, Romina.
Thank you for having me, Vero. This was a pleasure.